All right, so hello everyone. I hope you had a great Chuseok holiday weekend. No, holiday weekend, holiday weekend. So hopefully you could have the restful days with your family and your significant other and other people. All right, so let's get started with the asynchronous lecture covering the week six materials. All right. So the topic of the week six, which was the Chuseok holiday week, that was about the South Korea's democratization. So in South Korea, there were many of the societal the changes from very authoritarian legacy with the very powerful leader. So usually without the free ways of the argument and the ways of the companionship, but there were also many of the development changes based on the mass protests and some of the debates and also some consolidation of the democratic changes. So based on the two articles assigned, so we will cover some of the multiple changes of the transition from authoritarianism in the regime and democracy through the two articles. All right, so this asynchronous lecture is consists of the four major parts. So introduction and overview, and the first article, the Han Song-ju's analysis about the 1987 democratization, which is the June protest started from the southern western part of the South Korea. And then in the next article, we will go through the regress, which is the retrospective view of the democratization of the South Korea based on the democratic consolidation. And then, so as the part, the concluding remark, we will look through the what are some possible the comparison based on the tables and based on the time trajectories with the compared with the neighborhood countries in South Korea. So neighborhood countries would be China and Taiwan and Japan in East Asian countries. All right. So on the South Korea, so even though we cover about the long time ago, 1987 to 2008, South Korea has the relatively a short history of the democratization. So the transition to democracy is a very significant political development of the late 20th century. So as you all know, so before the liberation of the South Korea, South Korea was under control of the Japanese imperialism. So after that, within 70 years, around the 70 years, South Korea had a very rapid development of the economy and many of the social system. And the political regime also changed a lot. So from the royal family ruled country, the very traditional country, to the very highly democratic country. So democracy refers to the process through which political system transforms from authoritarian rule to the democratic governments. So in these days, we all share the common sense that every 5 years, without any of the political hassles, we have the presidential election, and we would have some very clear guideline that those who were voted on the highest data frequency and the highest volume of the votes from the Korean citizens, and they will be elected as the next president. But before that, there were many of the very powerful military doctrine, which was not working. Which was not very related with the very free right of the vote. So that was get along with the global context and part of the third wave of the democratization, which was so after the World War II, there were some of the competitions of the political regimes, and so the one part of the countries, so one not the half of the part of the countries, but one the major part was the communism, and another part was the free market and the capitalism. And most of the capitalism countries, so they were following to the political regime changes of the more the increase of the democratic developments. So in terms of the East Asian perspective, so which was probably very, very highly imposed in Japan or Taiwan top-down, the South Korea's transition involved with many of the the protests and elite negotiations. So we cannot say that there was only mass protest or only elite negotiations because these were worked all together. And then there were some of the causal relationships altogether, and they developed together to result in the democratization of the South Korea. So in this article, I mean in this week's chapter, we will cover some of the transitions from the June democracy movement happened in 1987 and the two key cases of the democratic consolidation. So the major question of the lecture today will be how did South Korea overcome its authoritarian legacy to establish a stable democracy in these days? All right, so this is the scope of the coverage in this weekend chapter. So based on the liberation from the Japanese colonial rule, so South Korea, I mean, not South Korea at the point of time, Korea was under control of the Japanese imperialism. So Korea was the colony of the South Korea, but after World War II, the two shots of the nuclear bomb, uh, Japan was collapsed, and then 1945, there was the first level of the liberation from the imperialism. And then Republic of Korea established, but there was also the civil war between North Korea and South Korea. And then there were some of the transitions, but there was the very powerful political leader. So as you may know, so former the military general, so Park Chung-hee, he made the coup, which was happen or tried to happen last year in South Korea, and he was doing the try. He was trying to the coup d'état, and then he was succeeded to make the transition of the political regime. And then there was the Yushin Constitution, which was the strategy to continue his presidency. So as you could see, it was 11 years later. So he stayed in the presidency, in the leadership very long time, very long time. So there was the very big issue in here. And then after the assassination of the General Park, which is President Park, and there was the political regime by another military leader. And then there was the June democracy movement, which was the insert point of the transition. So there was a mass protests, and even though there was violently controlled by the military power, by the government, but there was on the menu of the transitions. So we will go over more and more details, but there was many of the important events change the transitions of the the democratization of the South Korea. So there was the military-dominated governance under Park Chung-hee, which is again political leader, and the Chun Doo-hwan, 1980 through 1987 characterized a very rapid economic development alongside the political repression. So there was a very slow development of the democratic the changes, but in terms of the economics, there were many parts of the rapid parts of the economic development. And there was the democratic transition within 10 years. The period of the institutional reform beginning from the direct presidential elections, which were very common sense in our setting. So there was the military general No Tae-woo. He was in the presidency, but only 5 years, not like the Park Chung-hee and the Chun Doo-hwan. And then the first civilian president was elected, Kim Young-sam, 1992, and next. So there was many of the transitions within the civilian president. So we will go over what were the more details in that direction. All right, so based on the first article, so Han Sung-ju, 1988, very long, very old article, the politics of the democratization. So analysis of the 1987 transition from authoritarian rule to democracy based on the ruling party. So authoritarian legacy, so pre-1987. So before 1987, South Korea experienced very, very long decades of the authoritarian rule. Again, the Chung-hee Park regime, there was the coup d'etat of the military general, and very long time, so around over 18 years, he was in the presidency and the leadership, which is very, very strong doctrine of the South Korea. So they had the military control and the limited political freedoms and economic, but even though there were many of the economic development that prioritized over the democratic rights. So they tried to oppress the rights of the people and the citizens over the economic development. So Duan Zheng, he also had the coup continuation of the authoritarian system following the Guangzhou massacre. So after that, there were many of the debates and many of the so very harsh arguments among the parties and among the political regime on the parties. But they didn't happen under military power of the presidency. And electoral college system, which was the president elected through the indirect electoral college dominated by the ruling party. So they were gathering. So they were gathering in some of the hiding place and like a gym, and not all the citizens or who have the right to vote, they join the vote of the presidential election. And then there was elected in like in black boxes. So then they couldn't know. So they could not know the process, but there was very hidden system and very closed system, the presidential election. And there was a repressive measure restricted the media. The media freedom was not estimated at that point in time, and limited civil liberties and the anti-communist security laws used against political opponents. So there were many people who tried to put the more liberal and put the more democratic the culture in the political system, but there were very harsh oppression on the saying that based on the community security law and the national protection and security law. So based on the dictatorship and on the isolated power of the people, so there was only the very elite ruled society of the South Korea. So in January 1987, so there was the public dissent and the catalyst for change. South Korea became the pivotal catalyst for democratic change. The torture of the deaths of the civilian who was the student, very young generation, Jong Park, which was the very elite student. While under the political integration, he was dead. So there was some of the news press and indicating that the cause of death was not by violent, but it was very clear, and there was some context, very clear context that he had a torture, and that may resulted in the death of the very young student, elite student. So this incident galvanized the public sentiment against the John regime, the Jutuan John, and provide a very rallying point for the mass protest for the democracy movements. So based on the quotation, the torture deaths of the Chongchul Park not only gave the anti-government movement in and outside political, but rallying point for the also contributed to strengthen the position of the hardliners with the opposition, who now regarded the government as the weak and vulnerable. So his death confirmed the government, generated nationwide outrage. Memorial service began outside the protest. Middle-class citizens who were very highly educated in the professional jobs, including the professors and the medical doctors, and many of the very highly professional workers, they joined the president protests, and opposition leaders gained a moral authority in confronting the regime. And then opposition leaders would be the who are trying to oppose, so who are trying to criticize the military regime. So such a broader public mobilization in the June democratic struggle. So, in the June of 1987, an unprecedented political mobilization across South Korea, accumulating the June democratic struggle that would force the government to capitulate in their reform demands. So, even though that was not only very successful, that led into so not like the big tragedy of the massacre in 1998 in the Gwangju. So there was a scale, in terms of a scale, very large volume of the protesters. Thousands of students and citizens participated in the demonstrations that spread nationwide. And the structure and who were there, initially they started from the students, the university students, and even the the secondary students, and the protest gained widespread middle class support. And there was the escalation of the participation. Protests intensified after June 10, after when No Tae-woo, which was anyway, he was elected in the next president, but who was also the general and who was also the part of the coup of the John Doo-hwan. He was nominated as presidential candidate under the indirect election system. And protesters who used the fire bombs against the riot police who were hopelessly outnumbered. And in terms of the impacts in the urban area, Central District in Seoul became what the New York Times described the war zone. So there was many of the chaotic situation. And then on June 8th and June 29th, there were declaration of the negotiation between the elite, the political elites. So facing widespread protests in June of 1987, the John government found itself at a critical juncture. Either deploy the military troops as they did in the 1980, or risk a civil war, or make significant demographic concessions, which is the negotiations on the contracts, the negotiation on the contracts. On June 29th, No Tae-woo, who was the candidate of the president, surprised both government supported opponents in his historic declaration. So No Tae-woo, the present situation is extremely grave. I'm determined to undertake the bold reform for national reconciliation and the democratic development. So based on his decision and the negotiation, they he tried to make some of the arguments and some of the future appointments based on the items, including the direct presidential elections. It was very hugely formed before February 1988, revision of the election law to ensure fair campaigning, and amnesty for Dae Kim, who was the very long time the political leader in the more liberal party, restoration of his civil rights, and release the political prisoners and the restoration of the civil liberties, freedom of the press, and the promotion of the local autonomy. So probably the article was published there right after. But anyway, so there were many of the very surprising the amendment of the rules and the emerging norms of the democratic country. So in this review, there was very rapid transitions. So competing between or some of the negotiation between the public protest and the elite responses. So in January 15th, Jongchol Park's torture deaths that led into the very high very condensed levels of the protest in April 13, just suspended constitutional debates because indirect election will continue. And people were very angry. The nationwide protest intensified as a result of the constitutional debate, and then the middle class and the older, or relatively older generations participated in the protest with the students. And then June 10, so the political party, the military party, no, not the military party. So the very conservative party nominated the No Tae-woo as the presidential election candidate. And then the massive demonstration following the those nomination war zone in Seoul. And then he found that it's no more available to keep the high levels of the tension and made a declaration of the accepting opposition demands for the direct elections. So he's saying that the democratization emerged from the mutual pressure. Public demonstration could create urgency while elite negotiation determined the specific form of the transition. So these were very highly correlated and made the transitions together. All right, so as a result, despite the public turmoil, South Koreans, the economic transitions that developed very, very highly. So in 1987, so continuing its robust growth trajectory from the previous year. The GDP growth developed a lot. So in these days, so even after the many of the political instability in the United States and the global economy, South Korea is undergone with the very low levels of the economic growth. But they, within 1 year, they had the 12 point of the second point is, no, no, sorry about that. 12 point of the on the development of the economy, and part of the income reached 2,800, which is very small compared with now, but there was very big development, a very big reach of the um, development. And surplus of the on the economy and the foreign debt reduced a lot. Inflation remained very, very low. Korean won appreciated by the 1.9%. So there were many of the very positive aspects of the economic development. And sectoral roles of the labor, some machinery, and electrical, the steel, textiles, and chemicals, and the construction. There were very huge amount of the development and the very, very increase of the volume of the changes. So we can see that the machinery, which was their main the item of the development, the economic development in the economic magician, and the labor and less impact. So there were many of the disputes and the superiority. Workers in strike and labor force increase, labor cost increased. So there were some of the very, even though there were the labor arrest and many of the protests, but there were very high levels of the increase of the economic system. So economic indicators, so we can see that based on these summarization, or we can see that relatively compared with the general levels of the development, we can see that they had very high levels of the stability in the economic development. So hopefully, so there were many of the tension that in the political regime, there were very high levels of the tension and the competition between conservative party, I mean the dictatorship party, and some of the opposition party, which were the civilians and more the liberal parties made very harsh on the oppositions to the on that point in time the regime of the Conservative Party. All right, and then we can see the worker pay raises of the 15% average, which is very, very high, right? So, for example, if you had the $1,000 as income, and then in the next year, you will have the 115, 100, I don't know, 100, I don't know, 1,000, 150 dollars or something like that. So if that trend on the kept along more and more, the labor power and the labor income was increased very, very quickly. So which is very, very positive aspects in term, even though there were very harsh the protests and the harsh levels of the on tension among them. All right. All right. So even though there were some of the key weaknesses, such as simple plurality voting, no roundup requirement, allowing candidates to win with the minority support, no vice presidency provision, complete succession of the power sharing. So there was many of the weaknesses, but there were many of the very positive aspects. So that was the very big landmark of achievement of the South Korea's in the development of the demographic transition, such as direct presidential elections by the popular vote instead of the electoral college in the black box, and single 5 year term instead of the very long time, the 18 years or more than 10 years limit for the president to prevent authoritarian tendencies, strengthen the civil liberties and the political rights protection, and enhance independence of the judiciary and creation of the decentralized local governments, maintain the strong presidential system, but with the enhanced check and balances. So there was very big development and a big improvement at that point in time. All right. So even though there was the big change of the electoral system, but there was the feature for the four major candidates competing in the South Korea's first direct presidential election in 16 years. So Roh which was the former general who participated in the coup d'etat of the Duan um, so Chance chose to prevent the successor and the former military general. The campaign focused on the stability and the continuity while promising the democratic reforms. So as you may remember about the structural functionalism, the conservative theory on the conservative party and the conservative groups of the people they usually focus on the stability instead of the huge levels of the changes. And there was two very, very popular the leaders of the liberal parties, which is the Kim Young-sam and the Kim Dae-jung. And they were the very long time opposition leader with the strong support from the Gyeongsang provinces, which is the southern and the right, the southern, the southern eastern part of the South Korea, which is more the conservative positioned as the moderate democratic alternative. So they were not very, very, he was not very, very not liberal or very, very progressive, but moderately conservative compared with others. And Kim Dae-jung, which is a progressive opposition leader, with a strong support based on the southern western part of the South Korea. And then he was recently restored from the political rise after years of the persecution. And Kim Jong-pil was another one. So another one as the third on the candidate in the civil or more the opposition party. Former Prime Minister under Chung Il-park appealed to conservative nostalgia for the economic growth period. So as you may remember, there were some of the changes in the increases in the income in Cheonghi parks. In the Cheonghi parks, the political regime, they had very high levels of the development and increase of their economic system. So older generations at over time, they had the nostalgic memory and they wanted to return into the era of the very high levels of the increase of the economic development. So there was the big deal in there. So unfortunately, even though there were the very big transitions with the political regime, they could not achieve the turnout of the people in the more progressive and the more liberal party. So as you might know, or in the history of the South Korea, so Tae Ro, who was the former the general and who was the part with the successor of the political leader, I mean the military leader, Tuan Chun. He won only 36.6% of the vote, which is not very high. So out of 100, the less than four people, no, no, sorry about that. Out of 100, only 36 or 37 people voted for him, which is the very, very minority, very minor, who had a very minor support in the history. And Young-sam, the young Kim Young-sam and the Kim Dae-jung, they were all on the composite parties, but they didn't have the consensus that who would be the major, the candidate. So they competed it together, and then, so as you can see, a little bit less, not little, but there was the less vote, 28% and 27%. But if they add up, so if they were having some of the consensus and made the conclusion that who would be the political election candidate, they might win. So we cannot say that they will have the 56% of the vote. That's not the equation of the politics. But anyway, they could have the very high chance to win on the presidency. So opposition candidate charged the government with unfair campaigning practices and alleged fraud in the ballot counting. Despite the challenges, the Prince power proceeded, marking the Koreans' first peaceful democratic transition. The Mayan government faced immediate legitimate challenges, so the crisis of the expectation for the demographic reforms. Again, so as you can see, so again there were the political leaders, and then longtime opposition leader of the Young Sam Kim was relatively conservative but still very progressive, and the most progressive leader of the Dae Kim, formerly side opposition figure, and the Jong Pil. who was the who is the three kings in the Korean history. So anyway, they could not win the presidency, but there was the big. All right, so we can see that the very literal voting patterns in deserted provinces. Okay, so I told you that the Gyeongsang province, which is the eastern part, and which is the northern part of the Gyeongsang province, which was the hometown of the Tae-ro. We can see that about 67% they voted here. All right, Gyeongsang South, Kim Young-sam's home, and 60, no, sorry about that. 56%, Jolla area, Daejung Kim, 86%. So this is very fun, very, very interesting, very, very interesting composition of the voting, saying that the region of the votes would be determined a lot by their residency and the hometown. So there was how a regionalism, which is the regionalism, very, very salient still in the contemporary South Korea, but in terms of voting patterns, which candidates receiving overwhelming support in their hometown, now at home provinces. So these transitions, and these were not the transitioned very well in the contemporary South Korea, but there was the very big changes. But anyway, so in any way, there even though there were the divisions of the splits of the power. But even though they could together, if they were in the together, they could win because the combined opposition, very simple, very, very simple, the calculation, and they could win. So despite the widespread pro-democracy sentiment, opposition leaders failed to unify behind a single candidate, resulting in the featured vote that allowed the ruling party to take the power. All right, the regional rivalries between the Gyeongsang, which is the Kim Young-sam's base, and Jeolla, Kim Dae-jung's base, prevented the coalition and the building. Kim Jong candidates further drew the vote from the traditional conservative constitution. So probably the Jong-pil Kim, he only got the very, very little, so 8.4%. He could come. That was coming from the more of the conservative party. So in any case, the divided opposition not only brought itself down, despite the fact that the two kings together received more than majority of the votes, it produced a minority government that would face challenges in the legitimacy. So anyway, the democratic process have been followed, but the outcome left to the new administration with the minority support. All right. So despite the system tradition, significant obstacles in demographic consolidation is identified the author. So there was the opposition division and deep-rooted regionalism, military influence, and the minority government legitimacy. The rivalry between the Young Sam Kim and the Kim Dae-jung persisted, preventing united opposition and weakening democratic forces. So if they could unify, so that might not be possible because they had all very high levels of the confidences in their chance of the winning. And voting patterns follow the regional royalties, particularly between Gyeongsang area, southeast area, and the Jeolla, southwest provinces, compared with Seoul or other areas. And despite civil government, military retained significant influences, with former General Roh as the president. So there were not very even chances of the campaign. So because the Tae-ro, they had the governing power from the military system and also the public administration system. And Ro can face legitimate challenges with the very low levels of the vote. All right, so based on Arthur, so the democratization aligns with the Samuel Huntington's the concept of the transplacement, a theoretical framework explaining democratic transition that occurs through the joint action between ruling elites and the opposing forces, right? So the terminology transplacement is neither purely top-down nor purely bottom-up. So, but negotiated transition. So, as you might remember, some of the on the public protest and the elite negotiation requires a mass mobilization to pressure the regime and threaten stability. Simultaneously, requires a pragmatic elites within the regime willing to compromise. So, if there were some of the people who are not willing to compromise, so this is the political sensitive. So, we could see some of the trials of the coup happened last year, and resulting in the negotiated pacts that agreements and the contracts that protected some interests of the outgoing regime and create gradual rather than revolutionary changes, explaining Korea's continued authoritarian regimes. So based on that, the regional antagonism, the sharp Gyeongsang-Jeolla divide continued to the structure of the voting pattern and the political loyalties. And there was still the strong presidency. In South Korea, the president is very strong now, but at that point in time, the president was even more stronger. Constitutional design maintained a powerful escape with the limited checks, resembling previous authoritarian structures. Even though the election was the democratic the strategy, but still it was the authoritarian one. And there was a military influence. Former military figures retained a significant political influence in the Roteus presidency. So the prime minister and many of the very, very highly important positions in the government. So the former military people, or they attained those positions. And elite-centric politics, more focus remained in the elite negotiations rather than broad grassroots participation, like NGO. They did at the point in time there were not many NGOs, but institutional weakness as the personalized political parties and limited civil society autonomy persisted through the transition. All right. So based on the summary in his analysis, provide a contemporary account at that point in time, it's not now, in 2025. So the former account of the Korea's 19th and 1987 democratization as a complex interplay. So not the sole play, but interplay between the mass movements, protest, and the elite negotiation. The transition, termed as the transplant model of Samuel Huntington, succeeded through the balance of the protest pressure from below and the willingness and the compromise from the above. The authoritarian regime chose negotiation over repression when faced with the unprecedented mass mobilization. Opposition division between the two Kims, they will undermine their electoral protest despite the collective winning majority support. Regional voting patterns emerged a critical factor in election outcomes, and they still persist in the contemporary 2025 South Korea. Democratic transition was achieved, but domestic challenges remain due to minor government. All right. So in concluding remark on the South Korea in the democratic past while revealing the enduring influence of authoritarian legacies. Despite the imperfect transition, Korea moved a giant step closer to the joining to the rank of the advanced democratic countries. So that's why it was very, very meaningful on the transition from the authoritarian regime to the less authoritarian but more democratic regime. All right, so this is the first part of the lecture today, and lecture with the asynchronous lecture, and I will come back in the next video.